Hello, you should be hearing a voice and music now. If not, click the sound symbol to the right. Hola, usted debería escuchar una voz y música ahora. Si no, por favor, pruebe su sonido haciendo un clic en el símbolo de sonido a la derecha. Al entrar al webinar, podrá seleccionar el lenguaje en el cual quiere escuchar este webinar. Sus opciones serán inglés y español. Para escuchar solo español, tendrá que seleccionarlo y silenciar el idioma original haciendo un clic en donde dice Mute Original Audio. Vea la gráfica abajo. Estaremos con usted pronto. We will be with you soon. Hello, you should be hearing a voice and music now. If not, click the sound symbol to the right. Hola, usted debería escuchar una voz y música ahora. Si no, por favor, pruebe su sonido haciendo un clic en el símbolo de sonido a la derecha. Al entrar al webinar, podrá seleccionar el lenguaje en el cual quiere escuchar este webinar. Sus opciones serán inglés y español. Para escuchar solo español, tendrá que seleccionarlo y silenciar el idioma original haciendo un clic en donde dice Mute Original Audio. Vea la gráfica abajo. Estaremos con usted pronto. We will be with you soon. Hello, you should be hearing a voice and music now. If not, click the sound symbol to the right. Hola, usted debería escuchar una voz y música ahora. Si no, por favor, pruebe su sonido haciendo un clic en el símbolo de sonido a la derecha. Al entrar al webinar, podrá seleccionar el lenguaje en el cual quiere escuchar este webinar. Sus opciones serán inglés y español. Para escuchar solo español, tendrá que seleccionarlo y silenciar el idioma original haciendo un clic en donde dice Mute Original Audio. Vea la gráfica abajo. Estaremos con usted pronto. We will be with you soon. Hello, you should be hearing a voice and music now. If not, click the sound symbol to the right. Hola, usted debería escuchar una voz y música ahora. Si no, por favor, pruebe su sonido haciendo un clic en el símbolo de sonido a la derecha. Al entrar al webinar, podrá seleccionar el lenguaje en el cual quiere escuchar este webinar. Sus opciones serán inglés y español. Para escuchar solo español, tendrá que seleccionarlo y silenciar el idioma original haciendo
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Mennonite Central Committee webinar series on immigration and border realities. My name is Tammy Alexander, and I'm Senior Legislative Associate for MCC in our Washington, D.C. office. And today's topic is asylum. It's the third webinar of our six-part series sponsored by the MCC US Immigration Network. And the purpose of this webinar series is just to help you stay in touch with what's happening across the country, at the border, and outside the US related to migration. Immigrant communities and individuals who were already vulnerable before the COVID-19 outbreak are even more vulnerable now. And as media coverage today is focusing almost solely on the response to the pandemic, there aren't very many immigration or border stories making it to the top of our news feeds. But there is a lot happening that we want to make you aware of. People seeking asylum at the border is, of course, nothing new, though numbers have risen in recent years due to a variety of factors. Even before President Trump came into office, asylum seekers had to navigate a very difficult and complex process that involves multiple government agencies and often takes multiple years. And that process has become exceedingly difficult over the past 3 years, and even before the pandemic had reached a point where very few asylum seekers were making it into the US. So for about the next 90 minutes, we're going to talk with MCC partners from around the country who are experts in the area of asylum, and they're going to provide us with some current information about what they're seeing and help us understand both what asylum looked like before the pandemic and how the current situation has created extra hurdles and hardships for asylum seekers. We also want to look at how various organizations and faith communities responding how they're responding, and some ways that each of us can get involved in supporting those who are seeking asylum. So each of our three panelists are going to present for about 10 minutes, and then we will open for your questions. All of the attendees on the webinar are muted, so you'll need to submit your questions using the chat feature on Zoom. If you're not familiar with Zoom, just look on the bottom of your Zoom window. In the middle, there should be a little button that says chat. You click on that and it will bring up a window to your right that you can type questions into. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, please just include their name in your question. All right, so let's get started. Our first panelist is Alexandra Miller with the Florence Project in Tucson, Arizona. Alex is a Tucson native, and she has degrees from Georgetown and Stanford. And she participated in the Stanford Law School International Human Rights Clinic, investigating prison conditions in Panama, indigenous land rights issues in Peru, and police brutality in Oakland, California. She spent a year in Bangkok with the International Organization for Migration in their counter-trafficking department, and has been a pro bono contributor and member of the Black Affinity Group. Alex joined the Florence Project in Tucson in 2019 and became the managing attorney of their border action team in April. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, everyone, and bear with me as I get my PowerPoint started. All right. So I just wanted to do a brief update on asylum and the realities we're seeing in Nogales and Arizona. And just to add to the background that Tammy just shared with you, the Florence Project dates back to 1989 and was primarily started to focus on detained migrants in the state of Arizona. Back in 2017, however, we started a partnership with the Kino Border Initiative, a binational nonprofit in Nogales, Sonora, and Nogales, Arizona, that focused on bringing humanitarian aid to migrants in Nogales, Sonora, food, resources, etc., and decided to partner with the Florence Project to add legal services to that menu. Starting in 2019, the Florence Project created a designated border action team with the goal of dedicating a team to border issues and expanding services both within detention and at the border. Now, what we've seen, not just in response to COVID-19, but over the past few years, has been a pretty complete dismantling of the U.S. asylum system. To start, to make sure we talk a little bit about what we mean by asylum. Asylum is basically protections under U.S. law and obligations under U.S. treaty obligations to protect people who are afraid to go back to their home countries due to persecution because of their membership in a protected group. The primary difference between asylum seekers and refugees is that refugees are outside of the country, while asylum seekers are within the United States or at the border or an airport presenting and seeking asylum, either affirmatively if they're in the United States or through removal proceedings if they're detained at a port of entry. When we talk about dismantling U.S. asylum protections, it dates back to 2016, even under Obama's presidency, with metering at the borders. And this has expanded significantly in recent years, though changed a little bit with COVID. It's a policy that forces asylum seekers at the border to wait in line for their chance to ask for asylum. And that's something that didn't really happen before. It's supposed to be to create order and organization and help the government theoretically process people in an organized manner. But what we've seen is it's really meant delays in processing, and it has not increased capacity. Adding insult to injury, in January 2019 is the Migrant Protection Protocols, or remain in Mexico, or MPP, and that's a policy by which asylum seekers are forced to wait in Mexico during the pendency of their immigration proceedings, with very limited exceptions for victims of human trafficking and people who have requested asylum in a transit country on their way to the United States. Due to COVID-19, these hearings are currently postponed, and folks in MPP find themselves in limbo. Another policy that has significantly impacted asylum in the United States is the interim final rule, or what is also known as the transit ban or the asylum ban, that went into effect in July 2016 or July 16th, 2019. And it's a rule that basically says that anyone, sorry, I think I misspoke earlier about MPP. But anyways, speaking about the transit ban, it bars folks from asylum who have not applied for asylum previously in transit to the United States. And that means almost everyone at the border right now, whether in MPP or if they're still being metered, or if they're being barred from entry at the border because of the CDC order, which I'll talk about in just a moment, no longer qualifies for asylum unless they're a victim of trafficking or have applied for asylum on the way. MPP applies writ large and is up to CBP's discretion whether folks are permitted to enter the United States and pursue their asylum claims from detention or from liberty, or whether they're forced to wait out the pendency of their claims in Mexico. Now, when we're looking at MPP, it creates a number of complications and dangers for asylum seekers, including being thrust into dangerous circumstances in border towns, circumstances that are particularly dangerous for people in MPP who are known now to be specifically targeted by cartels, and also targeted by some state actors in Mexico for extortion because of their vulnerability. Moving on to the CDC order, which was put into place in March 2020 as a reaction to the current COVID-19 pandemic. It basically is an authorization justified by public health interest, saying that the border is closed now to people who do not have proper documentation because they cannot be safely processed in CBP custody. This effectively bans all asylum seekers and unaccompanied minors from entering the United States and asserting their asylum claims. It also bars any other migrant who doesn't have a visa or some other permission to be in the United States. While the CDC order does have a kind of broad exception for public health benefit or other public interest benefit, we are not seeing that discretion being used at all, and it requires sign off from a supervisor and is left completely to the discretion of CBP with Customs Border Patrol, with no oversight from any judicial authority. So what we're seeing is that basically the border, at least in Arizona and Sonora, is shut tight. It's also worth noting that the public health justifications for the CDC order fall flat, and that scientists and public health experts have resoundingly denounced this action, as it seals the border to asylum seekers and unaccompanied minors, but does not actually put in place any reasonable protections at the border for any other migrants that are crossing. It surgically targets vulnerable migrants and asylum seekers, and it ignores the fact that there are ways to address the public health concerns at the border without shutting off asylum protections completely. And when you're looking at tensions between two different laws, for instance, there's a law on which this public health initiative from the CDC order is based, However, the US is also obligated under national law and international treaty to protect people who fear returning to their home countries. And when there are two laws in tension, usually you're supposed to find a way to protect the intent of both laws to the extent possible. However, the CDC order wholesale robs the United States, or robs asylum seekers of their rights under US law to assert their asylum claims. So what does this all mean, and what are we seeing at the border and in Arizona? What is the impact on asylum seekers and the services they can receive? So first and foremost, the population that we have historically worked with in Nogales is very quickly being rendered invisible. The CDC order basically permits people to be pushed back to Nogales without full processing, without documentation, and they're usually sent back to the nearest port of entry, which could be a random port of entry where we historically have not worked. We're seeing a lot of people in Agua Prieta and Sasabe and other border towns in Arizona when they normally would have been sent to Nogales. There is currently a stay-at-home order in the state of Sonora, Mexico, which means that the same government actors that have been accused of extorting and mistreating migrants in the state of Sonora are now authorized to enforce a stay-at-home order for a group of migrants that might not have stable homes and might be forced to be outside. This puts them at an additional risk. While our partners KBI are still working on the ground in Nogales, the services they provide are limited because they have to implement social distancing. And the Florence Project is now providing exclusively remote services in Nogales 3 times a week, primarily consultations, assistance with declarations, translation of evidence, and what we call NRI preparation, or helping people prepare for what are called non-refoulement or non-return interviews. They have the right to ask for these interviews. However, what we're seeing is CBP is not permitting them whatsoever. We are also seeing significant changes to our work in detention centers. La Palma, one of the 3 detention centers we work in, has one of the highest rates of COVID-19 in the country. And we think that the confirmed cases underrepresent the actual number of cases in the detention center. We are hearing from a lot of clients in detention who are very concerned about their health, who still do not have access to adequate soap or the ability to socially distance, and a number of clients with high risk factors like cardiac diseases or asthma or other lung conditions that put them at high risk for COVID. Unfortunately, while we have secured release for a number of people, a lot of people remain detained even though they are at high risk. We are also trying to navigate how to provide services in detention centers when we have limited, restricted access, and how to provide competent representation when and if we're unable to accompany our clients in court. And one of the biggest issues we're confronting is the fact that we are not notified whether our clients are going to be actually brought to court. And we are not told whether any accommodations are going to be made if we appear telephonically to make sure that client privilege is respected and that we'll be able to adequately prepare our client prior to hearings. Right now, because of the risk of COVID-19, the Florence Project is not going into detention centers. A number of other nonprofits have taken different stances, but we are trying to find ways to, respect the fear and the real concerns of employees while still maintaining a presence in detention and fighting for our clients' rights. So, you know, I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts that we can circle back on when we go to our questions. But what now? How do orgs continue to push forward on the ground? And how do we as a community move forward to support the migrant population that so desperately needs our help right now? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was really helpful information. We got a message that some folks aren't seeing the video of the panelist who's speaking. If you're having trouble with that, just put your mouse over the boxes at the top that either have the videos or the names of people, and there should be a little box that pops up with 3 little dots in a blue box, and you can say to hide non-video participants, and then you should see only the person who is presenting at that moment. All right, our second panelist is Priscilla Orta. She's Senior Staff Attorney for ProBar in Harlingen, Texas. Priscilla is originally from Defiance, Ohio. She has degrees from Harvard and Columbia and was a founding editor of the Columbia Journal of Race and Law. She worked for the Department of Justice as an attorney advisor to immigration judges in Harlingen, Texas, spent 3 years as a community lawyer in Kansas, and then worked as an attorney in Chicago, working with MALDEF and teaching immigration law at Loyola Law School. Last year, Priscilla moved back to Texas to work for ProBar, where she is now the senior staff attorney for the adult team. So welcome, Priscilla.
Ha! I was on mute. Hello. So I'm trying to put myself on the right view, but what I'm going to present on today, oh, there we go, is actually more about what did things look like before COVID. I think there's this impression that, you know, before COVID, you know, we were getting people in, things were looking all right, we still had asylum, and that's not true. The government, the administration was having an effect, was stopping asylum seekers, and was slowly taking away the right for people to seek asylum. And I thought the best way of doing this was actually through stories. In my year here on the border, I have literally dealt with a change in law and in practice every single month. And it hasn't quite been a year yet because I started in June. But what I have seen has changed me, and what I have seen has been so fast and so destructive, and so, in many ways, it's very overwhelming. I actually have like a hashtag, which is Hug a Border Lawyer, because we are constantly having to adapt to new realities that may be published, may not be published, may be legal, may not be legal, but the fact is that they are impacting our folks. And so what you see behind me to start is what I came into when I started at ProBar, which was the MPP program. Now, along the border, the MPP program was put into place in completely different times, in completely different ways, in different circumstances for the most part. But in Matamoros, what happened was that it came in July of 2019. I started in June, and we knew it was coming, and it did start in July of 2019. And this is what it was. This is the Gateway International Bridge, that big red thing. So literally just right across from there is the United States, is Brownsville, where I live currently. And as soon as you cross the bridge, there would be hundreds of people, thousands of people sleeping in tents. And this was my reintroduction to the border. And it was very, very impactful. So what were we doing at that time? The volunteer efforts of people from ProBar, of people from the private bar in the Rio Grande Valley, and from international volunteers was immense. As attorneys, I was literally with my fellow companions, and if anyone's watching, and it was you, mad props, we were crazy, we would literally go into this plaza that you see behind me, and we would stand and we would speak with people, and we would begin filling out the immigration asylum forms, hoping that we would be able to have enough time to have them typed, to have them verified. But it was a very chaotic and difficult thing to do. The heat was oppressive. It was like 90 degrees. I was sweating. I don't like to sweat. You know, so we're standing there, we're sweating. There are desperate people all around us. At the time, there were very, very few bathrooms. I don't believe that there was yet a shower facility that was easily accessible. And so between that and our own heat and the smells and the crying children and it was overwhelming. And we thought that was the worst, but as I'm about to show you, things got a lot more interesting. So I'm about to share my screen, so please bear with me. All right, so here's my little timeline. So when I get there in June, there's metering. And so what's metering? Metering basically said you have to get in line, quote unquote, and you have to just wait your turn to get in. All right, but right away that was completely changed by MPP. So MPP was not enforced against all people. It is specifically Spanish speakers, and at the very tail end, I believe they threw in Brazilians as well and some Portuguese speakers, but I don't know that that was ever actually implemented in my region on Matamoros. All right, so MPP, we're all scrambling. We're trying to get attorneys, and we're beginning to develop systems. ProBar was very, very lucky to get a variety of funding sources, and we were able to get some attorneys, and we still have them, and they're amazing working on these cases. And we have many, many attorneys from across the country flying down here saying, what can we do? How can we do this? And so MPP began, though it was never fun, it was never fair, and it was never simple. We began to have a way of handling it, and it almost felt as though things were getting under control until they weren't. So in January, and frankly, please, if I'm off by a month, please forgive me, but I believe it was January of 2020, towards the end of December, we heard that Guatemala was going to open up itself to the ACA. So what was the ACA? So the ACA are these asylum agreements between nations. They're supposed to be, in theory at least, agreements between countries of equal standing and of equal ability to protect people. Basically saying, look, if a person lands here first, then that's where they're supposed to go. That's how it's supposed to work, and that's how we have an agreement with Canada. That agreement took, I believe, at least 5 to 10 years to work out, and is in fact still being challenged in Canadian courts today. But these agreements were now being applied to countries such as Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and they were more or less being forced to do them. I believe that all 3 countries were told various things, like we will tax any remittances or any money you send back if you don't do this, so you have to do what we say. So Guatemala opens up, and suddenly we don't see any Hondurans or El Salvadorans in the detention center. None, absolutely none. It was just as though overnight they disappeared. Well, they had disappeared, in fact. They were being sent directly to Guatemala. And in fact, they were actually given removal orders. They have expedited removal orders, and they're being sent to Guatemala, and they're given 3 days in Guatemala to apply for asylum. Between a variety of organizations in the Valley, we did attempt to fight this. We went into court, and we had one client, at least ProBar had at least one client, and the judge said that he didn't have jurisdiction over the case, and so we lost. There was another amazing organization in our region who was able to get their person released, but that was it, 2 people. And we really still don't have great numbers on what happened to the rest. And in fact, Friday, we found our first person who had been expelled under the ACA, who had come back to the border saying he didn't know what had happened the first time, but that he was afraid and he wanted to apply for asylum. They're finally making it kind of back up north. So that's happening, and we can't figure out a way to get in, and we can't figure out a way to stop it. We are speaking, all these organizations along the border, we're talking to each other. We're trying to figure out what to do. And then bam, we start having PACER HARP. PACER and HARP, I'll be honest, I don't know how much it was implemented along the rest of the border, but it was very heavy here between McAllen and Brownsville. And what was happening was that people were being put into this thing called the Donna tents. And they're called the Donna tents because they're tents and they're found in Donna, Texas. That's why we call them the Donna tents. The Donna tents are CBP property. Now, why does that matter? That matters because organizations like ProBar and other attorneys as well, the private bar, we don't have the right to enter those facilities. So what does that mean? Well, PACER and HARP were doing things that we normally represent people with. We normally help people before their credible fear interviews, and we prepare them and we help them understand the American system. And we also help and prepare them if they want to go before a judge in case they don't pass their CFI. So normally we see these people in detention centers like Port Isabel, and they call Probar because they see the phone numbers on the walls and people tell them to call us, and we help represent them, and hopefully they pass and continue. All of that stopped overnight. Overnight, it just completely stopped. And suddenly we had no Mexican and no Guatemalan asylum seekers. And they were all, suddenly they started calling us in February. And they would say, hi, we were told that you could help us. So we started getting calls from the Donna tents. And I to this day, I have no idea how or why or who started that trend, but it started. And so we were attempting to assist these people, but we still were not allowed inside the facilities. We still weren't allowed sometimes to even speak with them by phone. We would file documents saying, hey, we're their attorneys. And what would end up happening is that they would say, no, you can't talk to them. You're not their attorney. They've already been deported. So you would have whole families. I once was working with a family of about 10 Mexican asylum seekers who had evidence, who had photos, all of it had been turned in. I actually was very lucky and was able to represent them. And they just started, it's a railroaded process. They asked extremely specific questions such as, well, this particular city in this state, they had a crime level that was now 50% lower than last year. Why didn't you move there? It was a very unfair process, but there it was. And so as the border closed, we were dealing with all of these systems combining and coming together. And we were trying to figure out what to do. We were trying to see if we could stop it. But ultimately, it was a really bad storm because we potentially were looking at Honduras opening up its ACA. And we heard that they were going to be taking almost everyone. So there was a very small moment in March when we began wondering if asylum seekers would even be allowed to enter. Well, ultimately they could not. And that was explained a little bit earlier because of what we have right now. They're using a pre-asylum law, end of World War II law that basically says they have the right to keep people out in a healthcare crisis. Now, hopefully people will be challenging this. We're working with it. I'm getting the phone calls. I'm getting the experiences. I hear what is happening. But at this moment, we're still trying to figure out what we can do. And that has been my 11 months as working on the border. The administration had a very effective plan in place to create chaos and to lower the numbers. And I'm hoping our next presenter will be able to tell you how we're going to go ahead in the future and fight back against this. But with the border closure, which is more or less 3/20/2020, we still are seeing some people make it through, but very few. But effectively, the border is closed, and effectively, asylum as we understand it in any way, in any conceivable way, as the people in those tents behind me conceived of it, was not stopped, but was in a very precarious position right before COVID hit. And that's all I have to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Priscilla. That was a really helpful timeline, a lot of information there. If folks are already thinking of questions for Priscilla or Alex, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A now, if you'd like to. Then let's go ahead and get to our third and final panelist, and that is Lisa Koop. And she is the Associate Director of Legal Services at the National Immigrant Justice Center. She directs NIJC's Asylum Project, handles federal litigation, and provides representation and supervision in deportation defense matters. Lisa specializes in litigation, policy, and direct services advocacy on behalf of immigrant survivors of gender-based violence, and she heads NIJC's Indiana office and is an adjunct professor at Notre Dame School of Law. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. And Tammy, can you give me a thumbs up? Are you hearing me okay and seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So it is an absolute pleasure to join this group again and be a part of this MCC series. We are very grateful at the National Immigrant Justice Center to regularly partner with MCC, and I very much welcome the opportunity to share with you about What we're doing in this very bleak asylum context that Alex and Priscilla just shared with you. And as we have continued to represent clients both around the border and throughout the United States and here in the Midwest, where we're based in Goshen and Chicago and Indianapolis, the challenges have been large and troubling, and it's a really difficult time. But I also want to hopefully talk a little bit about a way forward and how do we preserve these asylum protections that we as human rights advocates, as for those of us who are people of faith, for those of us who believe in racial justice, how is it that we start to try and pull back some of these protections for our neighbors and our community members and our brothers and sisters worldwide? So I want to just very quickly speak again about the sealing of the border, and Alex provided the context of what happened on March 20th, and leading up to it, Priscilla, walked us through all these different programs that were kind of coalescing to really tighten the ability of people to receive asylum. And the sealing of the border on March the 20th was just another layer of complication and cruelty administered by this administration. And so there is this conflict between closing the border and our obligations to asylum seekers, to survivors of torture, and to unaccompanied immigrant minors. We have in international instruments and in our domestic laws, we have committed to protect those populations, and we're not doing that right now. And that's unlawful. That violates our own laws and our international treaties. And I imagine in the relatively near future, there will be litigation addressing this. And in fact, I know that it's already in the works. And so hopefully, that will move forward, because we think that they're going to extend this closing of the border. So it started on March 20th. It was supposed to end now in May. And as we hear the government, making noise about continuing this border closure, there is increasing urgency to respond to the fact that men, women, and children, unaccompanied minors, are literally being turned around at the border and not allowed to apply for asylum. And just yesterday, there was this letter from public health experts, physicians, scientists, doctors from our leading universities and hospitals saying, look, like, we know this is pretext. This is not a public health measure that we have to take to stop COVID. And in fact, it is being done precisely to stop asylum seekers from coming to the United States. And we know that by the exceptions that exist to the closing of the border. Wealthy people flying in on airplanes as tourists are still allowed into the United States, coming in on boats and planes that are far more likely to bring in the virus than individuals crossing the land border to our south. And so, kind of recognizing that pretext, I think, is an important part of this conversation, because I think there probably are a lot of our friends and neighbors and community members who are afraid, rightfully so, of COVID-19, of the spread of the virus, and to whom it might appear reasonable to say, like, okay, let's just hit pause on letting people into the United States so that we can protect ourselves and protect our communities. But it's really important to recognize that that's not what is happening. What is happening is that there's a very targeted attack on asylum seekers and on keeping people from the global south and people from countries that are producing asylum seekers from getting to the United States. And it's not being done in a way that protects any sort of public health principle or recognized reality. So what's happening then, so you have the class of people that are coming to the border and are literally just being turned around. And then you have the people who are stuck in the migrant protection protocols, or the Remain in Mexico program that Priscilla just so eloquently described to us, as people are being stranded in Mexico while they're waiting to continue their asylum proceedings. And what's happening to them during the time of COVID is again, another dimension of chaos, as they don't know what they're supposed to do. How are they supposed to continue with their asylum proceedings? The courts are suspended, but of course, none of them have addresses at those tent camps that Priscilla was showing us, and the areas that Alex was describing south of Arizona, and certainly in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, where NIJC has clients. There aren't asylum seekers that have an address where they can receive a notice of a new court hearing, or where the government can tell them, hey, look, you don't have to come to court on this particular day because your proceedings have been continued. Rather, they were initially told, no, you still have to travel to the border on the day of your hearing. You have to show up in order to get your court notice and get this special paper from Border Patrol. And by the way, you also need to extend your Mexican visa, because that's what's allowing you to remain in Mexico without getting into trouble with Mexican authorities, without facing possible removal from Mexico. And so a lot of our clients are really struggling to understand how they are supposed to comply, how they are supposed to continue signaling to the United States that they want to continue with their asylum proceedings. And we've had clients, many of our clients who have court in Laredo, Texas, are unable to stay in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico on the Mexican side because of the danger to themselves by cartels and by, in the form of other crimes that they experience in Nuevo Laredo. So many of them live outside of Nuevo Laredo and other parts of Mexico. And in order to travel into Nuevo Laredo to go to court, you have to show the bus company that you've got a valid Mexican visa in order to travel in. And so when people's court hearings were continued, a lot of our clients were very fearful that they wouldn't be able to renew their Mexican visas. They wouldn't be able to then travel into the border when it was time for them to resume their court proceedings. And so we had a client last week who made the trip from Monterrey, Mexico into Nuevo Laredo, and was terrified doing that because the cartel threat still exists, and migrants are still being targeted for kidnapping and extortion. And of course, the virus traveling during this time is dangerous. And our client, who lives in one of the shelters in Monterrey, was told by the shelter, hey, if you leave, we're locking the door behind you. We can't let people travel around, particularly to the border, and then come back into the shelter. And so she was in this really tough spot where she felt compelled to travel to try to get her Mexican visa extended, well understanding that doing that could lead to some really severe repercussions. So I'm going to let her tell her story in her own voice. She sent us a voice memo describing her trip into Nuevo Laredo last week, and I'll play that for you in her native Spanish, and it's in the translation in English on your screen. So hopefully you can hear this pretty well and get a sense of what she experienced trying to navigate seeking asylum during COVID while stuck in the Remain in Mexico program.
Todo fue muy difícil hasta para comprar los boletos y todo. Tenían que estarnos chequeando y no podían ir muchas personas en el autobús. Aparte, la policía tenía que estar escoltando el autobús cuando llegamos allá a la estación del bus también para ingresar, y todo era difícil. Para salir también del albergue era difícil porque con eso del coronavirus, si uno salía, en especial para ir a la frontera, les dijeron que no podían regresar porque se podían contagiar con el virus y traer y contagiar a las demás personas que estaban acá. También en migración casi no estaban atendiendo las personas y no nos dejaban entrar a la sala a esperar porque no podían estar las personas juntas, y en Laredo es peligroso estar afuera, pero teníamos que estar allá afuera y tener una distancia de las personas, 1 metro de distancia por el contagio del virus. Entonces todo era como bien complicado, aparte cuando llegué también a la terminal de autobuses. Fue como bien difícil porque estaban unas personas preguntando si uno tenía un permiso una clave para circular en Laredo. Y, o sea, tampoco todas las personas tienen esa clave, y si no tienen la clave, entonces está expuesto para que lo secuestren y tenga que pagar por esa clave para poder circular. Entonces todo era como bien complicado. Y no quería tampoco exponer a mis hijas y llevarlas para que no fueran a contagiarse. Entonces no sabía qué hacer y fue difícil dejarlas porque yo estaba sola acá y no tenía quien me las va a cuidar. Entonces tampoco podía llevarlas y era difícil porque tampoco tenía como la seguridad de que iba a regresar bien. Y si no regresaba bien, no las iba a poder ver. Entonces, todo era muy difícil.
So that was our client's experience traveling into the border, and she did manage to extend her visa and return to the shelter. And she had left her daughters in the care of an acquaintance at the shelter, and was allowed to re-enter her shelter when she returned, and so far appears to be healthy. But certainly it was a very harrowing experience for her, on top of the trauma that she experienced that caused her to flee to the United States to seek asylum, and the trauma she's experienced in the Remain in Mexico program while she's waited to be able to pursue asylum in the United States. Now, her case has been continued at this point until August, so she's got months stretching out before her, during which she will be forced to remain in Mexico before she has her opportunity to appear in court before an immigration judge and state her case. I was also going to talk a little bit about immigrants in detention, but I think we've maybe talked about that sufficiently, and we can circle back to that during the Q&A time if there's interest. I think it's important to talk about what happens to asylum. You know, we are now 3 solid years into this administration, and change, right? And they have very, you know, they've rolled out a lot of attacks on asylum and done a lot of harm to the body of law and to the individuals that have been trying to seek this protection. I think it is important to recognize, though, that there are still some victories, and there still is some space for hope, and the necessity that we continue to build on those cases, recognizing that there are far too many people who do not have access to protection, who are being turned away, who are being sent back to places where they face harm and death. But at the same time, recognizing that when people have access to counsel, when they have the ability to get before an immigration judge and present their cases, there are some people that are still receiving protection, and it's really important that we continue to build on that. So I just listed a few from this spring, from during this time of the pandemic, of the unleashing of all of these horrible programs. We had a mother who was separated during the family separation policy of this administration. She was separated from her child, and she sat in jail in South Texas in Laredo for many months. And she was denied asylum by an immigration judge who refused to recognize that as a lesbian woman who had been subjected to corrective rape in her home country, the judge refused to recognize that that was a reason she should be granted asylum. And we were able to represent her and fight her case on appeal. And she was recently released from the detention center and reunified with her child. And the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the first administrative level of appeal for asylum cases, said, you know, not only was the judge wrong, but the judge should have granted you asylum, and the board outright granted her asylum, which is something they very rarely do. So that felt like a huge success, you know, that she was able to stick it out and pursue her claim, and now has protection. And we had a mother, the picture there is the young woman who's holding the infant, is a mother of 4 who's experienced a lot of hardship in her life. And on March 12th, right before the court shut down and we stopped having asylum hearings, we attended her individual asylum trial in Chicago. And that's a law student from Notre Dame who represented her with us, and she was granted asylum. And it's really hard to win asylum claims based on domestic violence and gender violence, but we're still succeeding on some of these cases, and we continue to fight them. And we had a client who was in the Remain in Mexico program, and on March 17th, 3 days before they sealed the border, we were in the tent courts fighting her case. And she was another single mother who had fled domestic violence and had experienced severe harm in her home country, and managed to win protection in the MPP courts despite all of those challenges. And then even more recently, we finally received a written decision on a case that's been pending since 2014 of another single mother who experienced violence in her home country and applied for asylum, and was just granted protection just last month. So we look for those bright spots, and we cling to those, and hope to return to a time when those cases aren't quite so exceptional as they feel right now. And a few other bright spots to continue to focus on and lean on are the fact that some of our courts are still issuing strong precedent decisions. So these federal courts of appeals who issue decisions that impact the entire region where that court sits and change the law in good ways or bad ways. More broadly, you know, recently we've had 3 good decisions come out, one of which was in the Fifth Circuit, which is the area that covers Texas, where it's so very hard and the law is so very difficult. And the Fifth Circuit, you know, came out and said, hey, immigration judges, you have to take a close look at the country condition documents in these cases. You can't just say, oh, this is another claim from Honduras, or this is another claim from Guatemala. They're all the same, you know, and deny protection. You have to engage with the facts of each case and with the conditions put forth in each case. And that's a really encouraging sign from that court. And in other courts, you know, we saw judges say, hey, we're not ready to say that no survivor of gender violence, no survivor of gang violence can ever win asylum, even though that's explicitly what the attorneys general under this administration have tried to do through precedent decisions that they've issued. And meanwhile, there's litigation going on against a lot of the policies that we've talked about today. So NIJC, my organization, is involved in a case called UTB Bar, which is challenging those asylum collaborative agreements, those horrible arrangements where we're taking asylum seekers who reach our border and sending them back to Guatemala and maybe soon Honduras and saying, hey, you need to apply for asylum in those countries where there's not an infrastructure in place to meaningfully provide protection. And in IAV Bar, my organization, along with the ACLU and other partners, is challenging that transit ban. So saying, hey, that's not how our laws work. You can't limit asylum only to people that have already applied for asylum somewhere else. That's not how our laws work, and that's not what they say. And meanwhile, the ACLU is litigating a case called Innovation Law Lab v. Wolf, which is tackling the migrant protection protocols, which will hopefully bring an end to MPP. And they've had some successes along the way, and it's all still pending in litigation, but we're not without hope that there will come a day when that awful program no longer exists. And HARP and PACER, those expedited asylum programs that Priscilla was describing, will also hopefully similarly fall as a result of litigation, or also possibly if we see a new administration come into power next year, we'll be able to hopefully begin to recover from the damage that asylum seekers have experienced during this administration. So with that, that's the end of my formal presentation. I'll kick it back to Tammy, you know, to guide us through our discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you for all that information, but also thank you for helping us to put a human face on these issues. I know they can be very wonky and very technical, but it's helpful to hear those stories of how people are experiencing all of these issues. All right, so we have a few questions. If you want to submit a question and haven't yet, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A box. I guess it doesn't say chat for us, it says Q&A in the middle at the bottom there. So please, if you'd like to ask one of our presenters a question, go ahead and type it in there. And we will start with a question about the border closure. I think this is about the CDC border closure, and just asking about the status of litigation to reverse that and how soon that could possibly happen. So I'm not sure if that's Priscilla or who would like to try to answer that question. Yeah.
I'm going to toss that to impact litigators.
There's no litigation on file against the CDC order yet. I know that organizations that do litigation have been looking for plaintiffs and trying to set up the pieces to challenge this order. To my knowledge, unless something has happened since we got on this webinar, I don't think anything has been filed yet. I know there are a lot of attorneys and some really smart people working really hard to put together a complaint to hopefully challenge that. But as of yet, it's not, the papers have not been filed.
Okay, that's helpful to know. Thank you. And then we had another question about, is the U.S. breaking international law right now by effectively shutting down the border and keeping out people who are trying to seek asylum?
Yes. I mean, we can elaborate, Priscilla and Alex, you know, anyone can speak to this. I had listed, you know, the Torture Convention, the Refugee Convention, and our obligations to unaccompanied minors. Alex mentioned the no refoulement. All of you beautiful French speakers can say that word better than I can. There are a lot of laws and international instruments that we have ratified, that we are a part of, that we are violating right now. And that's the basis of a lot of the litigation that we've been referencing, is that, hey, you just cannot do what the government is currently doing.
And our domestic law, you know, is based at least in part on those international treaty obligations, right? So it's not just international law, but it's our domestic law as well that protects individuals' rights to not have to go back to places where they fear harm or torture.
Right. All right. Thank you. Let's see. Sorry, let me look at the list of questions here. Do any of you have any thoughts to what's going to happen? I know that the CDC border closure was for 30 days and then it was renewed for 30 days. So we're coming up, I believe, later this week on you know, another possible renewal or what might happen there. Have you heard anything about what the Trump administration might be planning to further extend that CDC border closure?
I mean, I don't have any insider information, but my expectations based on what's been done in the past and sheer speculation is that this border closure order will continue to be used as a pretext to keep the border closed, notwithstanding the fact that bars are opening and everything else that's going on in the United States.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to know, for example, the MPP courts, I believe it's till June 12th?
22nd.
22nd, thank you very much. So if they aren't planning on extending it, they're going to have, you know, a lot to talk about, because that's part of the reason that they say that they can stop these MPP hearings is because of this and because they feel like it, but that's a separate conversation.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, the New York Times has done some really strong reporting on, you know, all of the efforts that this administration has put forth in the preceding 3 years trying to reach this end, the closing of the border. And this became a very convenient way to justify doing what they've been trying to do all along. So with my colleagues, I fully expect they will extend that order for as long as they're able to.
All right, thank you. Can any of you speak to whether either CBP is seeking any additional funds from Congress or USCIS, who I understand they get most of their funding from citizenship and visa fees, which are not being processed right now. So have you heard talk of any major funding gaps and whether any of those agencies will be seeking more funding from Congress?
Well, I can talk about USCIS really quick, just because I think it popped up on some news outlet. They're like $1 trillion in debt. I'm not entirely sure how, by the way, because they charge exorbitant fees, but they are very deep in the red. So I am assuming they're going to ask for money. As for the Border Patrol, I'll be really honest, I'm not sure that they have to ask. It almost feels as though they're just given this money constantly. But if they ask for more, it wouldn't surprise me. It truly wouldn't.
I think something to add is the CDC order lists among its justifications the fact that CBP doesn't have adequate resources to safely process people, which on one hand is just like a startling admission that they were already unable to process people safely. You know, we do see people entering detention centers with chicken pox or measles or mumps, and these are things that are very avoidable and not necessary. People with the flu and them not being willing to provide flu shots, et cetera, right? So there may be a lack of capacity and general issues with CBP, but I don't think that those are things that they care to address, right? Because then they lose their justification.
And do you feel then that there might be an opportunity to address any of those issues if either CBP or USCIS asks for some kind of funding bailout, some kind of supplemental funding bill, if there'd be an opportunity to seek more humane policies? That's a question that we're getting from someone.
I mean, I think the quick response is we don't want better conditions of detention. We want no detention. right? So they can very easily fix a situation if they detain fewer people. That costs a lot less money. And when we're looking at the CDC order, they say one of their justifications is people don't have people they can stay with. And there's research that says that over 90% of people have sponsors, right? So there is a safe and cost-effective way to do this, avoiding detention and avoiding border closure, but that doesn't meet the political goals of the administration.
Yeah, I think, and I know Kat Smith is on this call, and she's done a lot of work around providing safe shelters for non-citizens leaving detention. And so it is, you know, again, if it weren't so cruel, it would be, you know, borderline laughable, the suggestion that people have no place to go or no safe place to shelter. If they were allowed or afforded the opportunity to leave detention. I do think, you know, the question of appropriations is a really good one. And yes, absolutely, we want immigration detention to end. But I think when CBP is going hat in hand to Congress and saying, we need more money, yeah, attaching safeguards to that, saying, you know, hey, if you're going to give them money, then, you know, we're going to require that you, for example, affirmatively ask people if they are here seeking asylum when you apprehend them in the field instead of just turning them around, or what are the other, and Tammy, I know this is your world, you know, with working with our Congress people and with representatives. I think absolutely the appropriations process is one place where we can try to import some types of protections. See, the USCIS question is interesting, and Priscilla was mentioning this. Yeah. USCIS isn't funded through appropriation. So USCIS is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and that's like the benefits branch of the Department of Homeland Security's immigration agency. So they issue like the employment authorization documents, and when you apply for citizenship, they're the ones that adjudicate that, and they run the asylum office. But they're all fees-based, so they don't get money from Congress. They get money by charging applicants. Well, they have narrowed the laws so significantly that very few people qualify for these benefits anymore. And they've also raised fees on so many forms that a lot of people flat out can't afford to file fees. And on top of that, with COVID and with the shutdown, far fewer people are in a position to file applications. So they have no money. And so they're threatening to impose an across-the-board 10% increase on all immigration applications. And they're also asking Congress to allocate money their way. And again, I think this is a good opportunity to contact your representatives. Hey, if we're going to give them money, let's ask them to, you know, to one, follow the law, and two, to also recognize or impose these safeguards. And Tammy, I know I'm kind of wandering into territory that you have better expertise than I do, but I think that's one mechanism that's available to us for advocacy.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And the appropriations process is one of the few areas we've had to affect change in the last 3 years, because that's, you know, they have to find money to do these things. And so that is an opportunity to try to introduce some change in other areas that we want as kind of a bargaining chip. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add really quickly, going along with this, please don't forget that there have been proposals by the administration to actually have a fee. So as you sense and you see these people behind me, these are the people they want to charge. I don't remember what it is, but it doesn't matter because they don't have it. And today, actually it was today, we had a person call and tell us that the judge refuses to accept, it's a different form of application, but the judge is already getting the message. I refuse to accept your application because you've lived here for so long. You don't deserve a fee waiver. So now this person has to go and find, I think it's about $110, $150 he doesn't have. So, you know, the things that they propose, they then pressure and sometimes try to implement before it's even an actual thing. So if you're going to be advocating, remember the asylum seekers. And if that's one thing you can do is keep them from touching, you know, a free asylum application. It's a very small thing, but it's definitely, I think, something we could actually win and do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So we're getting a number of questions asking how people can get involved with this work where they are. And I want to give our panelists a chance to each tell you how you can get involved with the work they're doing. But really quickly, before I do that, I want to plug a new MCC campaign that we just launched called Safe Home, Safe Refuge. We launched it last week. You can go to the website mcc.org www.safe-refuge. And the overarching theme is envisioning a world where people can choose whether or not to leave their homes, but then when they do feel they have to migrate, that they can be safe on their journey and find welcome when they arrive in a new place. And so throughout the remainder of 2020, we're going to be going deeper into these issues, taking a look at both root causes as well as asylum policy. And so on the website right now, we're starting with root causes. You can find stories and fact sheets. There's a 3-minute video, there's worship resources, and various other tools to help you advocate on these issues. We also have an action alert there right now calling for the Trump administration to halt deportations as they're basically exporting the COVID-19 virus to other countries through these deportations right now, and just exacerbating the health crisis in countries like Guatemala and Haiti. So that's the current action alert that we have up right now. So let me turn it over to our panelists and ask how people can get involved, and a couple of the specific things people are asking about. One, for folks who aren't attorneys, should we be focusing on voting, for instance, or getting out the vote to affect change? And then also asking about student and church volunteers. If this probably isn't a good time, for them to actually physically go to the border quite yet, but when do you think that might be possible, that you'll be welcoming volunteers back, and maybe what else can folks do in the meantime? So I'll just ask each of our panelists that question, and I'll start with Alex.
Hi, yeah, I mean, one of the biggest changes with COVID is it completely wipes out a lot of our volunteer base. And I know Priscilla mentioned that a lot of volunteer attorneys, translators, etc., were going down to Matamoros. It was the same for Nogales. It was the same in Tijuana with Al Otro Lado. And right now that really is not a safe possibility. That being said, in the meanwhile, I think there are some things that people can do. And importantly, these are things that you don't have to be a lawyer for necessarily, or a Spanish speaker for. I think sponsoring detainees whenever we're requesting humanitarian parole for someone who's detained, or even someone in MPP at the border, even though that's a Hail Mary, they need sponsors, right? And so if you're thinking about how to get engaged with your community, that is one thing you can do. Another thing is coordination around release. When people are getting released from detention centers, they need people to help them shelter. They might need people to help them quarantine before they go on to their sponsor. The Greyhound is now requiring face masks for people before they get on buses. Do you have extra face masks or hand sanitizer, or things that you can share with migrants as they're released, little toolkits for them? Generally with COVID, face masks, not just for migrants, but also for people that are working at the border and working in detention centers. Any types of PPE stuff that you might have. If you've got a sewing machine, you're making face masks, I can send you information to send them to the Florence Project, to KBI, but also to other partners that are working at the border that might be even more strapped for those types of materials than we are. Contributing to bond funds. And then, as we were already talking about, advocacy with local lawmakers. If you do happen to be an attorney and want to take on bond rep or HP or appeals, hit us up. I'm gonna leave it there.
All right, Priscilla?
Yeah, so everything that Alex said, completely correct, but here's a couple more. I would actually also look at Team Brownsville and the people that are helping along the border. So massive shout out, Angry Tias and Abuelas of the RGV, as well as Team Brownsville, are still somehow feeding people every day, got the brand new tents after a massive rainstorm, is continuing. There's a global migrant response, is I believe what they are called. They're still paying an asylum seeking doctor from Cuba to continue to assist them there. They need your funds, okay? So if you have money, that's one very effective way to use it. Okay, so you don't have money. Now what do you do? The second best thing I can say is to please talk about this. I moved here from Chicago, and when I did, I continued to work with my friends from Chicago, and we continued to fundraise money through a local organization called Mennonite in Chicago, and we continued to bring volunteers. And I think the single greatest thing I ever did was just constantly have people in my home until COVID, because when you go into these camps and do work with people, even if it's to serve a meal, you're changed. Well, we can't do that right now. But what we can do is share the stories. And what we can do is make it clear that we as a country are not afraid of people who are trying to save their lives, that we want them here, that we welcome them here. That is very, very important, because I cannot influence the people that are closest to you because I'm not close to them. They won't change their mind listening to me. Trust me, I've tried. I've tried everyone, random people in the street, supermarkets, I've tried it all. It works best when it comes from you. And so that is what you have now. You have this knowledge, and I don't know how you're going to forget that picture, because I never have. So take that and share it. It can be on Facebook. I don't suggest it. It doesn't end well, but it can be in phone calls, WhatsApp, however you're trying to maintain your life. Don't let these stories get lost.
Thank you, Priscilla. All right, Lisa?
Yeah, I think the only additional thing that I'll add is, we are in an election season, and it's such a truism to say it, but obviously elections have consequences. If we weren't convinced of that before, that's certainly very clear now. And so a lot of candidates are holding online town halls, whether it's a Facebook Live event or a Google Hangout or whatever. And that's a way to go there and ask informed questions and push our leaders or would-be leaders to take a position on some of these issues and to, to become informed and at minimum aware. I do think, we see the numbers, I think we're all sort of mentioning it, the public polling, people are like a little bit tempted to say like, oh, it's okay to seal the border because of COVID. And I think it's just so important to educate our communities and help people understand that this is not the answer to that, this is not responsive to the pandemic. And so we need to adhere to our moral obligations to asylum seekers, and we need to continue to extend protection. And all of the ways that I think so many, and I'm seeing a lot of the names of people on this call, and I know so many people are already doing so much and practicing radical hospitality. And so I think people will continue to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. And it was helpful to hear you contrast the fact that wealthy tourists are being allowed in and they're somehow essential travelers, and yet asylum seekers who are escaping violence and in many cases, possible death, that they're not somehow considered essential. So that's I think an important message. And then I know there have been a number of physicians groups who have pointed out that there are perfectly safe ways that CBP could be processing in asylum seekers right now if they just had the will to do it. Yeah. All right, we had a request for Priscilla to repeat the organizations that she mentioned. I know you mentioned Angry Tias and Abuelas. I don't remember if you mentioned another one. We can also put them in the follow-up email.
Yeah, it's Team Brownsville. So Team Brownsville, and then Angry Tias and Abuelas RGB. I think if you just look up Angry Tias, it pulls up, and same thing, Team Brownsville.
Okay, we'll try to get those in the follow-up email too for folks. All right. Oh, and we had a question here from someone who is an interpreter asking if there is an English word for refoulement. I know Lisa or anyone, if you want to take a crack at that.
I know, I see that. And Sylvia, I know if there is, you know it, but I don't think there is, because all of us non-French speaking attorneys are going around saying like non-refoulement. And I know that it sounds terrible to your ears, but that's like no refoulement or non-refoulement is the language I think most people are using, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
I think refouler is like to return, right? So it's just this legal concept. It's a legal term of art, and it's the concept of not returning someone back to harm. A long way of saying no direct translation.
Right. All right, well, did our panelists have any last thoughts that you wanted to share before we close out today? If not, I just want to thank all three of you for your obvious dedication to this work and for the really excellent information that you shared today. Thank you for taking the time to do that. And Thank you to all our attendees who also set aside some time today to learn about these really important issues. The webinar has been recorded, so if you missed part of it or if you have a friend who wants to listen, it will be available on the webinar registration page tomorrow. And you will receive an email with the link to the recording and additional actions and resources that were mentioned by the panelists today, as well as a reminder to sign up for, we have 3 more of these webinars coming up, and the next one will be on Tuesday, June 2nd at the same time as today, and will focus on church efforts to address immigration. And this webinar again has been brought to you by the MCC US Immigration Network. Please stay well and be safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for being here.